Before we begin with today's topic, I would like to address some questions I received regarding the seven rays. The theme of the rays underlies everything we are discussing. I am not delving into them in great detail because their complexity would overwhelm us. However, the important point, and why I introduced them, is that the perspective we call esoteric perceives reality as a set of vibrations, vibratory planes at different levels of manifestation. It examines how these vibrations, through their interaction at specific levels, generate the types of forms we call physical. The level of perception in which we are currently anchored causes us to register ourselves as autonomous psychic forms. Consequently, we fail to perceive ourselves as emergence of vast vibratory fields, which are, in turn, generated by these seven fundamental vibrations. Broadly speaking, this is the hypothesis of the seven rays. I introduce it because it is essential to keep in mind that in the background of what we call esoteric psychology, there is the recognition that we are concretions of a certain type of vibration. Vibration at a very low speed, which to our perception creates the sensation of constituting separate forms. What we may call esoteric psychology presupposes a potential in terrestrial evolution, manifested in the human, that has not yet unfolded. It presupposes a psychic potential in progressive deployment. Non-esoteric psychology, on the other hand, starts from the premise of a psychic structure that is already organized and finalized, which can only expand upon itself, meaning it can only grow or heal itself. In that view, there is nothing beyond the psyche, or rather, the psychism does not imply a process of flowering potentialities in which, from an esoteric standpoint, we are only in the very first steps of unfolding. Consequently, from the perspective of esoteric psychology, traditional psychology deals with the early stages of human potential. I will limit myself to the word human so as not to sound too sententious, as there are far more complex ways to verbalize the potential for manifestation within planet Earth regarding the life of the solar system. Another point I find important to consider is that, from the perspective of esoteric psychology, unlike traditional psychology, our experiences are part of the psychic structure. In traditional psychology, we have a psychic structure that manifests behaviors and experiences, this or that event, as if the experience were relatively independent of the psychic structure living it. From an esoteric point of view, the experiences we live are intrinsic to the level of development reached by this psychic structure. In other words, what happens outside the psychic structure is the manifestation of a structure that encompasses the psyche. Consequently, the gaze we need to understand a specific psychic development must include the type of experiences the person undergoes and the type of world they build and inhabit. This world is intrinsic to the psychic structure. It is revelatory of the psychic process. Let us focus a bit more, always bordering our main theme, but beginning to center on the different aspects of the psychic structure from an esoteric point of view. In our previous meeting, we referred to this paradigm: inspiration, intuition, intellect, and instinct. What we call instinct in principle corresponds to a series of spontaneous, automatic behaviors that respond to the level of vibration we might call the vitality of the earth, or more strictly, the etheric plane of the earth. The vitality of the earth and the basic vital pulse of the human being, the vital energy that flows through the body and is connected to the surrounding vital energy in a constant exchange, is organized by what we might call imprintings, internal images, or a series of patterns that organize behavior. This is common to all animals. There is a vitality, and that vitality is organized by a series of patterns, conditioning images, through which the animal acts according to what it perceives, conditioned by those instinctive patterns. Instinct equals action. Question: wouldn't that be a conditioning of the etheric and astral bodies? Carutti: the difficulty here is that from one point of view, one must say that divisions do not exist, yet from another one must make distinctions. It all depends on the viewpoint we adopt. Now, what I am saying is that, for example, snakes have no astral body, or very little of it. Question: and when they are hungry, they act. Carutti: that is the vital body. It is pure vitality organized by patterns we call instinctive. Question: and mammals? Carutti: in mammals, there is indeed much astral. The astral emerges when there is a cavity, when forms define an interior and an exterior. This is why mammals, who are beings born wrapped or enclosed, possess an astral body, a potent astral presence. This manifests with greater force in gregarious animals, in herds. In principle, the etheric corresponds basically to the vegetable kingdom. A forest is teeming at an etheric level. It has a very high degree of vitality. If one is etherically sensitive, one will feel the vitality of the forest, the jungle, the sea, or storms. When we are deeply affected by a storm with much lightning, we are being affected by the presence of a very strong etheric process, even more so if the person's etheric body is very unstable. The brain will interpret it as fear or a childish response, but fundamentally, there is a degree of restlessness inherent to the storm, which is clearly vibration running through the etheric plane of the earth, which the personal etheric registers. At the instinctive level, there are basically the sensations provided by the senses, detached from all effective memory. When we add effective memory, we are including the astral. It is a world of sensations that, organized by patterns, generates behaviors. Sensations, patterns, action. At another level, we can make a distinction regarding what we call the astral. This refers to another plane where information circulates, and the example is the herd. Animals and herds communicate via the astral. These are collective fields, vital and emotional, in which the animal's sensitivity responds to pulses of fear, excitement, and so on, through the information flowing on that plane. Another immediate example of the astral is the bond between mother and child. When the child is very small, the mother knows if he is cold or distressed, even if she is at a certain physical distance. She knows it without a telephone because the information flows through the astral plane, from which the child has not yet differentiated. In physical terms, we can look at the esoteric structure from the viewpoint of the brain as a receiving system for information from different planes. This is a slightly different vision than that of the scientific brain, but it is worth introducing. The etheric level, the level of pure vitality sensations, corresponds to the rhinencephalon, the reptilian brain, where pulses linked to life, death, and intense sexuality reside. Very blind pulses. All of us have in the rhinencephalon a reservoir of excitement and a gigantic flow of energy. Meanwhile, in the world we link to affections, the physical sensors tied to this plane in humans are in the limbic system within the brain. This is a set of memories and pulses tied to what we call affections and emotions. The important thing is that when we speak of emotions and affections linked to the astral plane, we are carving them out within an individual human organism. In principle, what we call the astral, which at its most basic levels is also instinct, has much to do with the need for belonging. It is linked to the functioning of the herd. The fact that someone who isn't very interested in soccer spends their time watching matches every time a World Cup is played is because they are sensitive to the astral. There is a very powerful collective current, and one responds to it, not wanting to be left out. There is something that envelops you and leads you to participate in an activity that if you thought about it for a moment, you wouldn't engage in. When we cry because the national team loses a match, despite not caring for soccer, we are enveloped in collective astral currents. Note, affections are animal in nature. We know that a female gorilla cares for her offspring with almost as much affection as a human female. Although this bond becomes much more complex in us, the basis of affective feelings for offspring is something absolutely animal. Desire. And then the level of thought appears. This band is the most complex to approach. It is the one in which we usually move at the conscious level. It is fundamental to be able to visualize the relationship between thoughts and sensations, to reflect on what we call desire. What is a desire? We have a sensation. The sensation produces excitement. This excitement immediately produces an appetite. But this appetite in itself is absolutely transitory. It can be satisfied or not, but it is inherently fleeting. Our excitability pulses continuously before the constant interactions and objects of the world. But in principle, each excitement is temporary. Longings that respond to an instinctive pattern of necessity do not move us in the same way. The instinct to feed is one thing, But the desire to travel is much more complex. How is that desire formed? It is not pure sensation. There is thought in it. The sensation occurs and thought fixes it. This process is fundamental to understand, to meditate upon, and to see in all its complexity. Thought is this quality we humans have to reproduce the external world within ourselves and maintain that representation for a prolonged time in the mind. Consequently, we build a world different from the external one, a world capable of enduring, of not dissipating. We can contemplate the evolution of thought and see that, in the beginning, thought was very evanescent. There was a difficulty in sustaining thought over time. The fundamental learning at this level was to sustain representations, mental constructions over time. That is to say, thought creates time. We can see the sensation of time as the biological clock, a series of metabolic pulses. But what thought does is construct the sensation of time that lies beyond the biological, beyond the natural. This capacity, which we can see by analogy with a computer opening windows, overlapping one over another, and creating a depth of construction that has stages and imagines processes, recurring to accumulated memories to build past and future, is the development of thought. This capacity to represent, fix, sustain, and then combine is its fundamental core. Now, I want you to think of a primitive human being, or ourselves, when sensations arise from the excitement of our links with the world. Thought may or may not build upon those sensations. If thought takes that sensation, for example, the beauty of an observed object, it can fix that beauty, fix the excitement it produced, and convert that excitement into desire. That is, into a more or less strong impression that will lead me to act in relation to that object in the future. If it were simply excitement, it would pass without one organizing future behavior toward achieving that object. Every time thought returns to that impression, or the desirous fixation of the excitement, it intensifies and generates excitement by itself, leading us to think or imagine it again in a recursive process. I invite you to register this every time it occurs in daily life. Realize that a trap we often set for ourselves is that desire appears to us as something instinctive, spontaneous, of the order of instincts. If you observe it closely, desire is a relationship between vitality and thought. If there were no thought, there would be no desire as we know it. Our relationship between vitality and thought is what generates the world of desires, the successive fixations of images of what we call the desired, the fixation of sensations over time, the accumulation of sensations we want to repeat or reproduce, which are associated with images that remain fixed in our memory and are evoked as longings, moving us to seek the objects associated with them. We can think, then, that between thought and vitality, an entire world of desires is constructed, charged with sensations, emotions, and images that organize action but are no longer instinctive, even though they move us to action as if they were a second-order instinct. It is a second type of action, which is not what we call instinctive action. These are new imprints, imprintings, constructed by ourselves, by an individual in their daily life, but also constructed by the species through the millennia, configuring which objects are desirable. These objects are, in principle, all mental, even if they refer to jewelry, women, automobiles, power, or caviar. There is something here that is generally not reflected upon, and which Alice Bailey mentions several times in her texts. The human astral does not exist in itself. It is a product of the relationship between thought and vitality, between the mental and the etheric. The astral is that faint animal astral, but what we call the desire body, linked to the human, is not a self-sustaining principle. Rather, it emerges from the relationship between those two planes and constructs a new plane, a band that surrounds us, that is accumulated in our brain, and that permeates us collectively. Thought can create mental objects that are, in principle, not charged with sensation, meaning they will not move us to action. An equation is a pure mental object in the sense that it is not charged with sensation and, in principle, does not move us to action. However, the longing to have a house is also a mental object, but in this case, it is charged with sensation. It is affectivized, full of energy, and consequently leads us to action. Moving for a coat is not the same as the longing for a house that one builds, that one wants this way or that way, in a certain place, and with a certain level of comfort and beauty, meaning one fantasizes about it. An animal seeks shelter or builds it according to its instinctive conditioning patterns. But the human builds and builds mentally, and that acquires enormous power. Sooner or later, it becomes compelling. One cannot stop acting if that mental object has been repeated many times and has been intensely charged by successive visions. I want to lead you to see how desire is this intersection between thought and vitality that becomes charged with emotion. Here is the translation of the second part of the seminar, adapted for a global audiobook audience with the required terminology and tone. Question: does the desire for something require thought? But what about desire in itself? Carutti: what we might call desire in itself is this very vitality. Question: and the desire for survival? Carutti: that is this vitality. It is what I was calling instinct, pure vitality conditioned by first-order patterns. Even non-specific sexual desire falls into this category. However, a crush or an intense infatuation with a specific person does not. Question: which would already be the direction of desire? Carutti: it is the psychic direction of that vitality. I am being very Buddhist in this regard because I believe our modern psychology plays tricks on us. In almost all our psychological frameworks, thought does not seem fundamental to our pathologies. Our ailments appear independent of our thinking. In our evolutionary process, we are completely identified with thought, and this is a given of what we call our rationality. However, it is one thing to consider thought in terms of an equation, and quite another to consider the capacity for representation, fixation, and combination. This is why I believe that, upon deeper reflection, failing to make this distinction would lead us to say that animals desire, when in truth they possess instinct. A domesticated animal may learn to fix an image, perhaps through the promise of a sugar cube, and thus develop new behaviors. Question: so desire requires the intellectual element. Carutti: it needs to be fixed. Otherwise, it is pure pulse, a pulse that sustains itself for an instant and then vanishes, or one that is articulated through an instinctive imprinting, which is something far more basic. For a pulse to be sustained enough to motivate prolonged behavior, it requires something that lies beyond the vital pulse, something that precisely tends not to pulse. As thought develops, what we learn is to make this pulse as steady as possible, to sustain it. We can look at the evolutionary process of thought. It begins as something highly fluctuating and unstable, appearing and disappearing, incapable of concentration. When this type of thought is present in a person, we say they are dominated by very basic desires that lack the potency to sustain complex goals. Such a person lacks will. Their actions do not obey the force of will, but are driven by pure, flickering desire. Through the concentration of thought, we gradually convert these fluctuating or whimsical desires into will, in the sense that they become structures of desire sustained with tremendous potency over time. Question: which requires a great deal of energy. Carutti: sustaining those desires requires a vast amount of energy, etheric astral currents. Question: and a key word appears: imagination. Carutti: this is a world of images. In esoteric terms, at one level, one would say the astral world is a world of images. At another, the astral world consists of emotions, affections, and subtle sensations. Yet it is always organized into images. In principle, astral sensitivity registers information in terms of images. Here is where we find what we call the archetypes of the collective unconscious, not as vibratory proportions, but as images that compel our behavior without us realizing it. When I say compel, I mean they make us act, without us being aware that we are moved by this collective body of desires. Consequently, we can infer that if vital excitability is very high, the pulses of desire seeking immediate satisfaction will be very strong. At this level, it is more difficult to think clearly because one is too close to the vital pulse. Thought cannot sustain itself, let alone achieve abstraction. It fails to construct a clear image of the world it wishes to create in the future. It cannot build in terms of a plan or will. We can imagine that, in the face of such overwhelming vitality, images succeed each other with incredible speed. There is a fluctuating imagination that comes and goes. This is registered in dreams. If you go to a place with a very strong etheric field, in the heart of nature, surrounded by lush vegetation, you will dream excessively. You will have dreams that tend to be very fast, without much content for a psychologist to symbolize, because they do not emerge from a deep level. Rather, they stem from this rapid fluctuation of images triggered by heightened vital excitability. I want to draw a parallel between states that occur in people with a relatively high degree of integration of these three levels, so that we may consider those with a very low degree of integration. For example, a person with a very potent etheric body, powerful vitality, but with very fluctuating and unsustained thought will be full of images, highly excitable, and will tend to act almost mechanically. The etheric person is characterized by being so excitable they cannot stop acting. For instance, they might be prone to violence, even if they are normally a calm person. If someone provokes them, they feel they must attack. If an act occurs that is decoded almost instinctively as a trigger for violence, they cannot abstract themselves from the situation. They are highly excitable and respond almost blindly. We would say they cannot control themselves, meaning they possess little thought and little desire refined by intense thinking, which is what we call will. In reality, there is little emotion in this. There is simply a high degree of excitability that produces rage, but that rage is a very basic pulse linked to the etheric level. A person with excessive etheric energy and a low level of thought is hot-headed. They are caught in a game where too much etheric energy fails to be integrated, a vitality that cannot be balanced with the rest of the system. Question: what happens to the astral in that case? Carutti: I am simplifying here. I am referring to that excitability that makes me act and move towards something mechanically and unreflectively. Of course, there is always astral energy and always thought. It is a sliding scale. Maximum vitality generally generates a lot of astral energy, but it is a very basic astral combined with fluctuating, disorganized thought. Imagine ourselves in a shopping mall. There, a very fluctuating, erratic thought reigns, accompanied by an enormous amount of astral energy and an excited vitality that drives one to buy, buy, buy. Some people simply cannot stop shopping. Undoubtedly, there is a lot of astral energy in the infinite images of advertising and all the conditioning, but there is also a massive amount of etheric activity, that excitability exacerbated by the astral. Walk into a mall on a Sunday. If you are sensitive, it will feel intolerable. It is etheric astral, etheric astral, etheric astral. Thought runs in a completely non-essential, mechanical way, and will practically does not exist. It is a wave of excitations, clearly perceptible, and if you are sensitive to it, it can make you feel dizzy. Question: if someone with a high level of manipulation captures this, it could be very dangerous. Carutti: I want us to slowly think about a historical era or an evolutionary level where these manipulative individuals have not yet been generated. To be a manipulator, I must have a very powerful will or a capacity for the fixation of desire much higher than those around me. Evolutionarily, manipulative characters appear later because they are the product of a more complex integration. In the beginning, what appears is simply that raw excitability. To transition smoothly to other planes, let us think of a person who is also mental, but who is constantly building. They build constantly with their mind, and thus they are enveloped in constructions, which can be intellectual, ideological, scientific, or abstract. They build by composing mental objects. They do not perceive, they construct. What we call the abstract mind, in a deeper sense and on a richer plane, is receptive. Complex mental objects appear there. Patterns of the mental plane appear. Consider the example of the benzene molecule, which you might have studied in high school. There was a scientist researching the molecular organization of benzene. If understood, it would allow for the discovery of countless molecular associations in organic chemistry. However, he could not consciously construct a mental representation of that molecule. Finally, he had a dream in which a series of monkeys appeared, playing while joined by their tails, forming a specific pattern. That pattern was the molecular structure of benzene. In other words, the mental activity of that scientist did not build the structure piece by piece, analytically adding fragments. Instead, something captured a pattern from an unconscious level. Similarly, the discoverers of the structure of DNA, the double helix, which as we know, is the caduceus of Mercury or Jacob's ladder, tapped into a pattern that has appeared in the human brain for thousands of years. DNA did not appear to them as a puzzle being put together progressively. Even the executives at Microsoft in the early days were deeply influenced by the counterculture of the 60s. The type of mind that sees cybernetic patterns is a mind that passes into another state where complex forms appear. You haven't built them analytically. The references to dreams or altered states serve as examples that the perception of these patterns arises from another state of mind. If constructive, analytical thought is too active, the abstract mind cannot manifest. It cannot see patterns because that analytical activity occupies all the space. Consequently, what could emerge from other levels of the brain cannot appear. If the level of vitality is too excited, there is no possibility of receptivity to these patterns on the mental plane. The transparency of the various vehicles. The abstract mind is receptive on the mental plane. Within the world of subtle patterns and forms, intuition, in turn, is not merely a certain stillness of the mental process. It is a state of openness, a much broader receptivity that encompasses sensitivity in the emotional world. The being must be loving in the sense of being fully open and non-defensive for intuition to appear. The harmlessness of one's own organism and the perception of the harmlessness of the universe are fundamental conditions for the flowering of this intuitive plane. From this, we can deduce that for the organism to be sensitive to the currents of the intuitive plane, one specific vehicle must be absolutely limpid, the astral vehicle. Strong emotions, those linked to closing off, fear, or those that cause us to project in a constricted way, strong desires, must not be triggered if a relatively intuitive perception is to manifest. Furthermore, and this is much more abstract to verbalize, the level of inspiration is in alignment with much more essential vibrations. These are not human, but rather respond to planetary or solar life. At a much more global level, the life principle, vitality, appears. For inspired action to be effective, there must be a registration of the life of the earth, or of life at even broader levels. For this to occur without interference from more basic patterns of action, there must necessarily be a very specific transparency and fluidity of the etheric vehicle. This implies possessing great sensitivity at the level of vitality, while simultaneously maintaining very low instinctive excitability. The senses remain fully open, yet the sensory responses, conditioned through millennia of evolution, do not trigger automatically. Inspired action requires a vehicle that is extremely sensitive, yet extremely purified of the vibrations of fear and desire that have nested in our cells for ages. What we are saying is that for these levels of flowering to open, there must be a very high sensitivity in the preceding planes, but a very low excitability within them. Can we differentiate excitability from sensitivity? There must be a very high capacity for response, but without that response being triggered by mechanical patterns. What we called the torrent in our previous meeting is the constant triggering of mechanical patterns that generate mechanical behaviors, ranging from the most basic drives to the most complex plans, projects, imaginations, and theological constructions. In that state, everything is mechanical. There is high excitability in these planes, etheric, astral, and mental, and consequently, the organisms, both individual and collective, respond mechanically. They circulate according to a wheel of patterns, a matrix that organizes all possible experiences. We are suggesting that for thought to develop, there must be a delay in the preceding levels, a learned pause. If those highly excitable levels manifest too quickly, the behaviors of these instinctive and unconscious patterns impose themselves upon our conscious behavior. Just as this occurs with thought, The same must happen with the subsequent levels regarding the astral and the etheric. The transparency of the mental leads to the abstract mind. The transparency of the astral leads to intuition, and the transparency of the etheric leads to inspiration. Question: is that receptive quality linked to the feminine as a registration of non-action? Carutti: from one point of view, we can see it that way, but it is worth noticing how you are archetypizing, which is valid. What archetype emerges when we speak of these things? That is, what image constellates in the psyche to account for complex, multivalent information? The human being as a receptacle, a chalice, a pitcher. It is interesting to see how, when complex information appears, certain registration patterns, organized unconsciously, are automatically triggered. However, these patterns have their drawbacks. If I define these levels as feminine, the final response will depend on the various layers, both conscious and unconscious, that the person imagines as feminine and masculine. All subsequent conclusions, actions, and perceptions will depend on that specific articulation. The icons of archetypal symbolism are marvelous in their power of synthesis. However, we often lose sight of the fact that they are part of broader unconscious structures that are generally not in equilibrium within us. Thus, a series of unexamined conclusions are set in motion, giving us the illusion of having understood a great truth. Question: but by archetypizing, am I not delaying the more basic levels? Carutti: by archetypizing, certain levels of excitation are calmed. In this conversation, if we were very serene, perhaps much more abstract patterns would appear. Patterns that are not imaginary, meaning they are not conditioned by concrete experience. In fact, throughout this dialogue, a series of abstract, non-imaginary patterns are moving in the background, a complex mental form that contains this information on its own plane. Yet we experience the tension of wanting to understand at a verbal level, along with the anxieties of the I, which triggers all its higher desires. The restlessness to understand causes forms to be triggered. Imaginary forms used to capture the contents of the abstract mind, to grasp complex patterns from a lower dimension, relate to a certain type of archetype that we should investigate with great precision to allow the information they provide to settle. This world of images appears, culminating in what we might call symbols of high synthetic power. Question: like icons. Carutti: exactly. Icons that contain complex information. Information that, at an imaginative level, captures abstract patterns. For example, in this conversation, it is logical for the image of the pitcher or the chalice to arise, because it is an image, an imaginative level, reflecting something more abstract. Now, this is precisely where most esoteric information circulates. At this level of images and symbols, the right hemisphere, we might say. This has great value. However, at some point, we must review those images. They are highly conditioned and interpreted by a brain that carries biases derived from concrete experience, both individual and collective, which may or may not be resolved. In this case, the imaginary of the feminine is what is at play. We must ask ourselves if the organism that activated this symbolic perception has resolved its entire structure of the feminine, or if it will unconsciously drag its basic misunderstandings into these apparently subtle levels. There is a lesson here. By grasping something complex, an archetypal form is produced to capture it. I can either smell the perfume that the archetypal form brings to subtly enrich the conversation, or I can hoard the form and say, the human being is a pitcher. There we begin to fix the thought, to draw a conclusion that the human being is a pitcher. At that moment, it is no longer a receptive phenomenon. It has automatically become active because I have closed it. Unconsciously, all my assumptions about the masculine, the feminine, and their relationship are activated. Assumptions that are not necessarily in a true order within me. This produces a distortion I do not notice, which will have enormous theological or metaphysical consequences. I must discover that I close the concept out of excitation. Subtle excitation, but excitation nonetheless. Question: the astral appropriated that information and began to handle it at its own level. Carutti: let's make it more complex. The brain takes it at its level of forms, its verbal, imaginary, symbolic level. Question, and it crystallizes, thus losing receptivity. Carutti, it depends on the subtlety of the system. It depends on whether the system can operate in full awareness that symbols are reflections, or if it operates under the illusion that it has captured reality itself. Question, in that case, it closes. Carutti, I close it and draw a conclusion. I develop an entire doctrine about the human being as a chalice, which has its value, its richness, and its beauty, but also the fascination and the glamour that come from contamination with unresolved issues, such as sexuality. Since the basic levels are not totally transparent, they inevitably distort subtle perceptions. Question, but isn't it still useful? Carutti, do not listen to anything I say critically. I am attempting to describe and shed light on certain complex issues regarding our cognitive evolutionary process that are usually ignored. Shedding light and allowing illusions or dangers to appear is not the same as judging or condemning. The drift of the torrent. What interests me at this point is a line of drift implicit in the process we are describing. The torrent possesses an intrinsic mechanicity that moves toward the development of a very potent thought. This in turn translates into will, giving us the sensation of possessing a strong identity within an organism that is highly sensitive to the collective and has a relatively controlled vitality. Imagine first that high human vitality with still fluctuating thought 100,000, 200,000, or 500,000 years ago, with its first objects of desire still relatively evanescent. Then imagine the emergence of a more organized thought that begins to fix and construct, forming more complex objects of desire. At the same time, this thought enjoys a high sensitivity to the world of collective currents, to the world of human dreams, and to the imaginative capture of abstract levels. A person with relatively unstable thought, of low resolution and low capacity for fixation, can have strong astral perceptions as reflections of subtler patterns. Question, often those called mad present this capacity for registration. Carutti, the mad or the shaman of the primitive tribe, with a rich capacity for grasping realities at the astral level. Question, is this intuition? Carutti, no. This depends on whether that individual grants reality to what they capture, or if they can understand that these are only reflections of deeper vibratory realities. If they grant reality, for example, to a war between good and evil spirits, then they are moving within the astral. That movement will have a certain vitality and creativity, but it will be tied to experiences in resonance with that astral world treated as a reality in itself. Generally, the mental interpretation of that astral world is one of war, a battle between opposing principles. The logic of the battle belongs to the shaman and later to the devotee, because they are conditioned by astral polarization. On this plane, the difficulty lies in conjugating the pulses of negative and positive emotions. This opens a strong polarization that must eventually be resolved. Question, that would be dualistic thought. Carutti, exactly, because the mental principle is not yet sufficiently rich and complex. It functions through dualism and conflict. What is the problem? As thought becomes more complex, we need to lower the body's vitality because if we become too excited, we cannot think. Humans must self-domesticate. To live in a Chaldean city, build architectural works, and grasp the meaning of the complex constellations in the sky, we can no longer run like wild colts in the jungle or go hunting whenever we please. Vitality must decrease. Question, it relates to the transition from nomadic to sedentary life. Carutti, yes. If the mind learns to fix, excitability decreases. This is the sliding scale we must see in operation. To develop thought, I must minimize vitality. Question, sensitivity as well? Carutti, in principle, what decreases is sensoriality. Question, and what happens to sensitivity? Carutti, we will have to define very clearly what we call sensitivity. I believe distinguishing this is key. Now, as thought continues to develop, it learns to sustain itself more and more. Consequently, humans appear who possess great mental potency. They construct worlds for others. They configure worlds and objects of desire for others. The tribe configures objects of desire, but initially no one is potent enough in terms of differentiation. It is the tribe itself that shapes these objects. However, more integrated organisms progressively appear. Chiefs, kings, emperors, priests, who build worlds and mental objects that impose themselves upon others as desirable. It is important to see this drift of the torrent, which contains a complex sequence of experiences. In this sequence, thought inevitably discovers that it can obtain more and more energy and satisfy its growing longing to see its mental objects manifested. Thought thus learns to control itself and its environment by developing as will and as a potent mind. The process moves toward the progressive integration of these three planes through multiple human types expressing various levels of partial integration. First, I have the hot-headed person of potent etheric energy. Then, the emotionally sensitive person whose mind expresses a stronger idea. They are surely less hot-headed and possess lower excitability, which allows them to be less violent. They may be unstable, but they learn to develop in an effective way according to what we call goodness. We have achieved this through the force of thought, controlling vitality, limiting sexuality, limiting violence, and proposing new objects of desire, the fulfillment of the law, the satisfaction of ideals and moral principles, commitment to loved ones and society, and so on. The method we have used to domesticate ourselves is to propose new mental objects that are palatable to us through the method of reward and punishment, seeking to make them subtler than the previous ones. Question: more projects, and by desiring those, we lower vitality. Carutti: we domesticate vitality. For example, an object of desire might be for the tribe to be more powerful. In that, we feel very vital. As conquerors, we take a city inhabited by others who had a higher integration than our own. But very likely, little by little, the city itself becomes an object of desire. We want to live in the city. To be sure, some will be so vital that they will not want or even be able to live within its confines. However, many others becoming more potent as individuals will likely begin to feel pleasure and excitement with the objects of the city, with the life of the city. In the city, there are ideas, there are gods, there are works of art, beauty, pleasure, and well-being that attract us and begin to modify our profile as warriors. The mental objects of desire. At one level, we can say that an evolution is taking place here. A type of human organism must emerge with a different level of integration in terms of vitality, emotions, and thoughts. This requires a mind progressively capable of greater concentration and abstraction, and therefore an entity with less vital exuberance, less violent vitality, and a lower excitability. This is the mind capable of building the city and inhabiting it. The city itself is a mental object. In turn, the world of the city is filled with objects of desire: comfort, jewelry, clothing, art, and new gods, all relating to the qualities necessary for the highly social life of the city. Question: culture. Carutti: I prefer to call these mental objects because we happen to like the word culture, laughter. If I call it culture, I fail to lay bare the actual process, the construction of representations, the capacity to combine and sustain them over time, and the ability to coordinate them with action so that the world conceived within can manifest without. Consider the highly excitable ones, the conquerors. They have very basic, bloodthirsty gods who are closely tied to nature. These people live and sleep with their horses. They know how to domesticate them because they are deeply connected to vitality through their etheric and astral vehicles. All the information of nature flows through them, making their dialogue with horses and other animals extremely fluid. Their gods are warriors, more ruthless. Their objects of desire are linked to conquest, to an excitability seeking satisfaction through violence, the basic predatory attitude of the human. That same primal desire leads them to conquer the city, where a different vibration reigns. But in the city, there are other objects of desire, objects far more subtle and closely linked to the activity of thought. A piece of jewelry is a mental object. After all, who would think a jewel is relevant from the standpoint of vitality? A jewel serves no practical purpose. No one eats jewels. No one keeps warm with jewels. Yet we kill for them. We surrender all our energy to obtain a jewel, even though it truly serves no survival need. It is a purely mental object, an object of desire. Nevertheless, this mental object is exciting. The sight of a jewel triggers excitation. Question. It is an object charged with energy, charged with the energy that everyone projects onto it. Carutti. And so one searches their pockets for enough materialized etheric energy, which we call money, to make the energy transfer that allows one to say, this jewel is mine, or rather, this sophisticated mental object is mine. I call it a mental object because while one might say a jewel is a material thing, vibrationally it is not material. It has been conceived through a very careful design, and the goldsmith must possess a very special coordination to bring it into being. I want to show you the degree of excitation produced by mental objects. For some, this might not happen with jewelry, but perhaps with a book. What produces the excitation there is the mental process of comprehending, of understanding, or the peculiar craftsmanship of the word. I am not criticizing anything. I am trying to find the constant among behaviors separated by thousands of years that nevertheless coexist and share a profound common denominator. What I am calling the activity of the torrent. Evidently, some existences are linked to obtaining jewels, while others are linked to obtaining books, to the energy found in knowledge. Some seek to possess it, others seek to create it. Question, but always in relation to appropriation. Carutti. That is the drift of the torrent. Returning to our narrative. In the city, there are jewels in these new gods. The most excited conquer and destroy, but simultaneously something in them is being domesticated. Some carry away useless things. They kill and they rape. But eventually, some of those unknown objects begin to appear desirable to them. The comfort of the city becomes desirable. The idea of the horse in a stable, rather than a herd nearby. We are no longer attracted to living in the midst of the raw, etheric, and astral fields, but rather in a richer, more complex astral environment of useful mental constructions. Conversely, you can see that when a highly urban person goes into untamed nature, they become completely unsettled. All their fears surface. They become overexcited. They don't know what is happening to them. They have nightmares because they have grown accustomed to living in an astral mental environment with a very low etheric pulse. Suddenly, they move to a place of immense vitality with a different astral quality, and they cannot align themselves with it. The gods. When we conquer the city, we change our objects of desire. The priest who, in principle, cannot defeat a warrior based on raw vitality, has used his sensitivity to create a pole of fear and longing for others. He creates new gods, mental objects proposed to the warrior, who begins to be attracted by them. These gods pacify him. In an evolutionary sense, these gods calm excessive vitality and propose emotions we might call more subtle. They allow us to move beyond basic pulses of violence and elementary affections reserved only for our own. These city gods allow for the unification of human beings from different tribes and traditions. To the extent that we share the same God, even if we are quite different, new feelings begin to emerge between us. The mental object of God in a city or an empire summons an ascent in the astral plane. It implies a subtilization of the astral vehicle, in the sense that my affections will no longer be so basic or circumscribed. Through that object, broader emotions begin to stir within me, directed positively toward human beings who were previously strangers or even enemies. Question. The affectivity changes. Carutti. Because I can now include the different within my affective field, I no longer react so violently to what is foreign. These gods allow tribes to unite. Think of Yahweh allowing the 12 tribes to gather, or the Christian God allowing infinite peoples to unite, generating feelings of affinity with entire nations. Thus, the objects of desire change. How have we learned to make them more subtle? By changing the objects of desire through objects that are increasingly abstract and less primary, producing a different kind of excitation. Here the astral vehicle develops. We move from gross emotions to deep feelings. These feelings are induced by teaching and by the presence of symbols that summon those emotional states. For example, the emergence of the universal love principle from a religious standpoint, causes us to feel moved by the Olympics or the opening of the World Cup. This is because there is a powerful imprinting in us, a deep-seated conditioning and longing for the union of all humanity. When we see images that summon that give us a glimpse that it is possible for all peoples to be united, there is an immediate response and a very potent feeling is generated within us. Now the question is it truly effective lovingness? Is it a real openness toward humanity that manifests in us? Or is it the effect of an icon that has the capacity to generate that feeling after 2,000 years of domestication? I am not criticizing or devaluing it. I am only making a distinction. Question: there is an archetype that triggers that. Carutti: an archetype of union. There are archetypes and objects of desire linked to battle. For example, the exclusive, God. In this progression of mental objects for millennia, gods were exclusive. It was my God against your God, the God of one tribe against another, one people against another. My God is more powerful than yours and will defeat him. Suddenly, a glimpse of universal gods appears, allowing us to harbor much broader feelings of humanity. Regardless, as we know, the level of your God against my God is still very much alive. Question: that is why the Roman Empire adopted Christianity. Carutti: yes, it is the same effect. Question: the partial God of the tribe is the perception within that culture of something that is higher up. Carutti: yes, it is a unifying principle, a mental object that produces not an abstract reasoning of unity, but a vibration of unity at the astral level. It is a vibration of unity in response to an image, a conditioned vibration of unity, which is not the same as the plane of intuition. Question: because it became attached to the image. Carutti: because it is triggered by that image. If that image, or that type of image, is not produced, the state is not triggered. I watch the opening of the World Cup and am overwhelmed by a sense of human fellowship, but then I step out into traffic, argue with a taxi driver, and immediately exit that state of universal love. In reality, I was not in a state of universal love. I was in a conditioned response that generated that feeling for as long as the induction lasted. I am not devaluing this, because eventually thousands of years had to pass so that the vibration of the desire vehicle would long for the union of all human beings, rather than the victory at all costs of those who look like me over those who are physically different or believe different things. But it is still desire. It is not the perception of the union of human beings. It is the desire for the union of human beings. That is why it cannot be maintained. It is not a spontaneous vibratory state, but a response to an induction. This is why the priest must remain within the great reservoirs of the subtle astral, the temples, and constantly activate rituals, forms, and words that maintain that state of loving induction. Question: it is an illusion. Carutti: and if I look at it from behind, I would say it is a necessary illusion. One could say that subtler vibrations, working upon terrestrial matter and its various levels of substance, generate these icons as modulators of our basic vibration. When Alaric converts to Christianity, that icon begins to condition him. Alaric's great-grandchildren are less excitable. They delay their excitation. They become domesticated. Question: they don't sin so they can go to paradise. Carutti: exactly. Because there is an entire system of mental objects, of new and higher desires, and of rewards and punishments that condition them. Consequently, their astral vehicle is amplified and developed. It resonates with subtler vibrations. I say again, what is the problem here? The problem is that the vibration is not spontaneous. It requires icons to manifest. Only the icon triggers the vibration. We don't call it instinct because we don't like the word, but it is a turn of the spiral of instinct, the induction of a behavior based on an image imprinted upon my psychic apparatus. Question: in truth, it is an excited feeling. Carutti: and that is why it is transitory and needs to be reminded. After 2,000 years of images tending toward this, being trained from a very young age, across hundreds of millions of human beings, that feeling is activated, giving us the sensation that it belongs to us personally. Question: The games or the World Cup are an induction of thought so that different entities can meet on the plane of vitality without destroying each other, so they can meet by playing with that vitality. Carutti, while simultaneously channeling that vitality and, in fact, lowering it. Question, because those games have rules. Carutti, exactly. Question, it is a way of channeling the struggle. Carutti, it is the drift of the torrent. There is an expansion of possibilities for human beings. Yet at the same time, certain individuals develop with very potent minds and a great capacity to create icons and objects of desire for others, allowing those entities to capture a great deal of energy. Observe this paradox. The same loving principle that allows for the creation of these conditioning icons, generating feelings of conditioned universal love, simultaneously allows for the development of very potent personalities who lead millions of human beings according to their own desires. Generally, these leaders do not believe their desires are personal, but this capacity allows them to capture vast amounts of energy from others. Question, the key is creativity. Carutti, creativity and sensitivity are words that, when viewed through an evolutionary process, must be considered with great care. In principle, I would say that here, one learns the game of creating mental objects that are attractive to others, whether with the best of intentions or otherwise. Creating appetizable worlds for others becomes, for these people, an object of desire that organizes all their activities, be it a simple longing for power or a transcendent mission in life, serving the gods and so on. And so, the various vehicles and experiences, successive translations of the objects of desire are beginning to emerge. However, these translations ultimately remain within the same paradigm, that of a strong, integrated personality. This personality allows for a maximum level of mental articulation, balanced with a relative capacity for emotional resonance and feeling, all powered by the highest possible vitality that sustains such thought and emotion. For instance, a political leader of the masses must possess a potent mind, a formidable emotional capacity to induce feelings and an immense vitality. Question, this seems more difficult than being a musician. Carutti, that is a keen insight. Though it depends on the type of musician, as a process of coordination, it is more complex than that of certain musicians because the leader directs a mental, astral, etheric orchestra. The musician, meanwhile, directs a highly complex vibratory orchestra at the level of the abstract mind, with a profound receptivity to vibrations in the subtler astral. However, the musician typically operates with a lower quality of vital and emotional astral energy. It is a different form of coordination, and I say this without implying a value judgment. According to this sliding scale, the more one leans toward pure thought, the less astral and vital presence there is. This produces, for example, the intellectual or the scientist. If we move the scale toward the subtle astral, we find the theologian or the musician. An orchestral conductor possesses an extremely high degree of coordination because they are coordinating others, not just performing their own music. Yet in principle, the conductor possesses a lower astral resonance than the mass leader, who must learn to navigate incredibly powerful collective currents. Within the torrent, successive experiences are produced with varying levels of integration and potency in each of these planes in their coordination. We might strengthen one, then another. We coordinate two planes, or perhaps three at low potency, or develop the maximum possible potency of one while keeping the other two in coordination. Our current technological and scientific era, centered on the mental plane, allows for the development of individuals with this specific system, a rich and complex mind, but with low potency astral and etheric vehicles. Inaudible question. Carutti, you are referring to figures like Bill Gates. The drift of this torrent implicitly moves toward the formation of vampires. That is, creating units that respond to the principle of survival in a much more complex way. They are great captors of energy, perhaps great creators, but generally they are not wise. Question, they aren't just any kind of sage. Carutti, they are true cyberneticists. They are cybernetic predators. This is precisely the point, to see how the reptile still dominates the torrent in a subtle way. From one perspective, A highly developed and abstract mind is at work, but it operates within the structure of a predator. Such an entity might even be a philanthropist, interested in the welfare of humanity. Yet this type of mind rarely notices its own intrinsic cruelty. In any case, to keep this in perspective, let us say that a priest, for example, despite all his good intentions, is often equally unaware of the cruelty of his own mind. We must understand that the conditioned process is moving toward the creation of these types of individuals or systems. They are like vortices whose fundamental characteristic is the absorption of energy. This is their natural drift. Question: an accumulation of power. Carutti: it is an accumulation of power, from the densest levels to the most subtle, but it remains accumulation. Alice Bailey, in her particular phrasing, states, "Every white magician is a black magician until the third initiation." Every white magician, until a defined and profound process of integration occurs, is potentially a black magician. Only if the so-called third initiation takes place is one truly defined as a white magician. Put another way, it is only in a very specific state of integration that it is decided whether that organism remains trapped in the basic planetary vibration, or if, in esoteric terms, it begins to respond to the solar vibration. That is, whether it responds to the blind evolution of terrestrial matter, or to a more complex evolution, one where it learns to open, to include, and to respond to designs that lie far beyond the survival of the part. This brings us back to our first meeting. The global evolutionary process is moving toward another drift, responding to vital currents that are indifferent to survival. Meanwhile, the natural drift of terrestrial matter, which culminates in thought, leads toward entities that respond in a subtle and sophisticated way to the longing for survival. Question: in this case, the longing for the survival of an idea. Carutti: or a religion, a series of conditioning icons so beautiful that they provoke an attachment. These seemingly subtle forms capture energy without realizing it. The organism attached to these icons or mental forms cannot yet let go to open itself. It remains closed to the form and therefore repeats it and forces others to repeat it. Question: the torrent we live in consists of different forms of desire accumulation, and the accumulation of desire implies the accumulation of power. Carutti: the accumulation and translation of desire, which allows for its utilization, remains desire in the pursuit of power. This inevitably divides and generates conflict and pain. Inaudible question. Carutti: in principle, if we are not summoned by an object of desire, we don't even begin to converse. We converge only when we assume an object of desire that appeals to several of us. If there is a situation where objects of desire are omitted from the invitation, we find it much harder to participate. We could, in fact, propose a conversation that stays alert to this spontaneous manifestation of an object of desire. It is not a matter of repressing it, for that would simply be replacing the object of desire once again. The desire to have no desire. "I desire to have no desire," said the king of the vampires. Laughter. It is not about intending to have no desire, but rather asking ourselves, are we at an evolutionary stage where we can dedicate energy to understanding the dynamics of desire within the torrent without seeking any reward for doing so? Does the planetary vibratory process allow for meditation, observation, and perception regarding the dynamics of desire to be performed outside the structure of reward and punishment? The important thing is to formulate and sustain this question without closing it. Closing a question always responds to a state of excitation, whether subtle or coarse. Question: I was wondering if all this is why politicians scream. Carutti: what you are saying is that the icon that excites the collective regarding social construction is the image of someone screaming. We are conditioned for that. If they didn't scream, the type of excitation that makes society buy into it, that makes them surrender their energy to the direction the icon points, would not occur. Inaudible question. Carutti: the energy of the earth screws in. It corresponds to the root chakra, which closes, fixes, and locks energy into form. Survival is power, even when pursued with the best intentions, because it always implies halting the creative flow in favor of the truth of the moment. A vibratory current brings a truth, a vibratory pulse, but if I maintain it for 5,000 years, even if it was once a truth, it ends up being that which merely revolves and screws in. Now there is another turn that unscrews, which from the standpoint of survival feels like death. Question: because it disassembles, it opens. Carutti: it kills, it liberates, it loves. For love to emerge, there must be openness, and for that, there must be an indifference to survival. In other words, death. If there is no indifference to survival, it is not love. It might eventually be a very high sentiment provoked by another, but if that other is gone, the sentiment vanishes. Whether the other is a person in a romantic bond or a god to whom we surrender, they generate that sentiment in us. This is evolutionarily necessary, but it is vital to distinguish that this is not a vibratory state independent of an object. Rather, it is induced by the object of love. In the end, it is still a reaction.